Hello and welcome to the Fleadh Forum. It's a very unusual experience to be here today, but we're delighted to have you as part of the first of 3 webinars for the Fleadh Forum series. I'm Sarah Dillon and I'm going to moderate the event for you today. As we all know, the Fleadh has been an annual event for the last 32 years in our calendars, and we in the west of Ireland always love to welcome filmmakers and film fans from far and wide to the city of Galway to celebrate film. I hope most people have great memories of being crammed into the town hall to view a film, or listening to a lively debate at a panel session, or probably most of us have memories of having, a drink and a laugh at the rowing club. So I want to say huge congratulations to Miriam, to Will, to Debbie and all the team at the Fleadh for making sure that this year it continues, and it's been no mean feat to make it a virtual an online event. So again, I hope you enjoy the next couple of days. The Fleadh Forum again has been running. This is actually the 11th year of the Fleadh Forum, and it's always been an event that we've run out of the Radisson Hotel, the Galmont. And again, we've packed people into the rafters and have had, over 150 people for our events every year. And it's really a chance to look at kind of pertinent issues that have been facing our industry over the years. The Fleadh Forum is brought to you by the Galway Film Fleadh and the RAP Fund, and we're also supported by Screen Ireland, Screen Skills Ireland, the Galway Film Centre, Creative Europe Media Desk, and Ace Producers. So I'd like to thank them all for their support. And just for you joining us, if anybody wants to share any of your thoughts on social media, the hashtag is Fleadh Forum. And you may have picked up, there will be opportunity at the end of this chat to submit some questions. So if you want to do that, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. So just submit those questions and we'll try and get to as many as we can towards the end. So we're hoping to kind of have about a 45 minute chat here. And it's about all things development. So when we sat back and thought about what we put together for these sessions, I suppose development has become maybe the main function for a lot of companies and creatives over the last 4 months. And maybe it's given us the time to kind of reflect on what we're doing within our development and maybe look at a strategy for our development process. Often I think the next deadline is often glaring people in the face, and it's this countdown clock to make these deadlines. And sometimes we don't always have the opportunity to look at our slate collectively and approach things strategically. So we wanted to have a conversation about that today. And thankfully, agencies like Screen Ireland and others across the world have made lots of funding available for development over the last number of months to help companies. And I think there's 26 companies in all in Ireland who've just received slate funding, including Element Pictures. So again, I think it's a timely conversation to think about maybe your brand as a company, how that dictates what you might do in development, to look at your projects maybe from a strategic point of view. And also, ask some kind of pertinent questions as to how some really successful companies do that. So we have a really great panel. I want to introduce you to Ben Coren, who's the head of development for Film 4. We have Dionne Farrell, who is the development executive with BBC Films. We have Emma Norton, who's a producer and former head of development at Element Pictures, and producer and filmmaker extraordinaire Tristan Goligher as well from the Bureau in the UK. So I'm going to ask them all to come on, maybe switch on their mics, and maybe we'll start off with you, Ben, and you might just maybe introduce, Film 4 probably doesn't need much introduction, but maybe talk about your work at Film 4, the slate of projects you have in development, and specifically maybe talk about what is the Film 4 brand a little bit as well.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Yeah, I'm Ben. I'm head of development at Film 4 as of last year. I was a development production exec for many years at Film 4 before that. I think people probably know roughly what Film 4 is. We're the film making arm of Channel 4 TV in the UK. The brands, I always think the brand's quite sort of elastic. Like, we're obviously looking for very, strongly authored films from a kind of eclectic, diverse range of filmmakers. And we can kind of do quite a lot within that. I guess the big thing to say is that we're this hybrid model where we're a public funder, and we have a remit that we report to government on, but we're mainly funded by advertising. So in TV, kind of how that works is you have shows like Great British Bake Off that bring in a lot of advertising money, and that kind of allows the channel to support shows like more challenging current affairs or drama output that maybe isn't going to sort of guarantee advertising revenue. And kind of what Film 4 aims to do is to replicate that cross-subsidy model in some ways in its film slates. We'll always work with, exciting new talent and make a number of debuts in any given year. So films like St. Maud, Raised Heart of St. Maud, or Come With Horses, Bennett Rowland, that Element are involved in, or Ben Sharrett's Limbo, which is his second feature that's in virtual Cannes. So yeah, so exciting range of debuts, which we can fund in quite a sort of pure public servicey kind of a way. And then that's kind of offset by the bigger films from more established filmmakers with bigger casts, which we kind of know will probably have a greater international reach, not always, because some of the debuts, well, we hope all the debuts will really break out. So that's the kind of model we're working to in any given year, is kind of a range of exciting lower budget features alongside some higher budget stuff with more established filmmakers, and of course there's always a few that sit in the middle as well. But yeah, but within that it's pretty flexible. I mean, the stuff we talk about internally, as I'm sure everyone does, is kind of eclecticism and diversity. So obviously part of the Channel 4 remit is to do with underrepresented voices. So we talk a lot about diverse filmmakers in terms of backgrounds and different kind of racial diversity, but also in terms of gender, in terms of class, in terms of representing different parts of the UK, and making sure we're telling sort of untold stories within the UK alongside the material we might make that's set abroad. So it's a pretty eclectic range, but yeah, just aiming for that kind of range of budget levels and range of stories and genres and filmmakers across the state.
And I might ask you, Ben, how many active projects do you reckon are on the Film 4 slate right now, development slate?
I mean, quite a lot. It's over 100. But obviously worth saying that we're a funder rather than a production company that's kind of lovingly pushing a smaller slate of projects to production. And the fact that we have got quite a big development pot and we're quite a big funder does allow us to do a few things like kind of give a playwright we find interesting a little bit of money to work on a treatment with us, alongside kind of having several projects with one of our sort of more established directors. So there's kind of a wide range of projects within that slate, which are kind of looking to achieve slightly different things.
And Tristan, I might jump onto you here from the producer's perspective again. Maybe you'll talk a little bit about the Bureau and if you feel you have a brand at the Bureau and if that's important to you when you're looking at the development process.
Yeah, I think historically the company has been, I guess, seen as a production company who's prepared to back new talent and debut filmmakers, and that's very much the case. It was founded to produce Asif Kapadia's first feature, and we made Andrew Haig's first feature, and more recently Peter Mackie-Burns and Harry Woodliff. But one of the key elements of, I guess, our strategy and development is about maintaining those relationships and developing good long-term relationships with those filmmakers. So with Andrew, we're currently financing his fourth feature film, which we will do together. We are currently in the midst of production on Harry Woodliff's second feature, which maybe we can talk a little bit about. We're on hiatus, obviously, at the moment. In the Fleadh, we have Peter Mackie-Burns' second feature, and we produced his first film as well. So one of the key things for us basically is identifying talent that we really want to work with, that we believe in. We're prepared to, I guess, take a kind of a degree of risk on that. And ultimately, the goal is that we hope we'll be making their third, fourth, fifth feature films. In terms of the type of work we're looking for, we don't have a set policy as such, but I guess our taste has always gravitated towards strong character stories. Films like 45 Years or Daphne or Only You will fall into that. But definitely increasingly, we, as everybody on this panel will probably talk a bit about, you're trying to find ways of telling those dramas, which maybe are very personal stories that maybe reflect on the way we live in the world today. But you have to try and do that in a way which also can connect with an audience. And that's at a time when cinema is getting harder and harder. And certainly we have begun developing TV projects, which obviously Element have been doing with great success of late, producing some. And that's definitely something that is in our future as well, because the types of stories we love to tell often work very successfully in that format. So.
Brilliant. And Dionne, I might bring you in again as well to just talk a little bit about BBC films and I suppose, your aesthetic as a funder and as a brand, and how that informs the projects that you guys back and want to work on?
Well, we're a public funder like Film 4 or BFI, so we work in quite a similar way to how Ben has described Film 4 working, putting equity and TV license into the development and production financing of projects. We've got a development slate of around 100 projects actively in development at any one time, and before the pandemic were making around 15 to 20 films, feature films a year, while still also doing some short films in order to support newer talent coming through. I think similarly to some others that have already spoken, we're not very prescriptive in our remit or I guess in our kind of brand. Obviously BBC is an established brand that's known internationally, but I think particularly in light of recent events and evolving conversations around representation and inclusion, it's really important for us to try and keep abreast of that push for diversity in terms of the projects we're supporting and also the filmmakers, so that we want to have a real eclecticism on our slate, and we want to be making films that can cater to a really wide demographic and that can play on all of our channels, because whilst the hope is that they will get a theatrical release, that is, we're making films for the BBC. So that's kind of what, dictates things for us. Is we're very author driven and very talent driven, and that's at the heart of how we make our decisions. But I think we're also having to think about a lot about audience and where that comes into play, and who we're making films for, and what success looks like for each of those projects in terms of what their life is going to be once they're out in the world and have eyes on them.
Great. And Emma, I might bring you in here. I think Element, have worked very hard, Andrew and Ed, over a number of years, and you've been there for quite a number of years as well, to build this kind of world-class identity as Element Pictures. And I think there was a strategic process, and I might be wrong in this, where, Ed, I think, has spoken before about identifying maybe non-English language speaking auteur directors and trying to make their first English language film. And that has been maybe a strategy that they've pursued. But again, maybe to talk a little bit about what you think Element Pictures is and stands for, and how that informs the projects that you guys want to back and work on.
Sure. I think that we have talked about strategy over the years, and sort of almost in cycles of kind of every 2 or 3 years, we really interrogate what we're doing and why we're doing it and who we're working with and all of those things. And I think many things inform those conversations. And as you said, at the point that we maybe last spoke, there was this feeling that, we'd had this really successful relationship with Yorgos, and that our position as a kind of Irish production company placed us kind of fairly uniquely as a bridge between the kind of UK industry and the European industry, and and beyond that, kind of as an international production company. And so I think our kind of identity as a production company is informed by a large pool of talent that we've made a lot of effort to familiarize ourselves with as a group, and to find the people within that we love working with. And I think as Tristan said, kind of the Bureau and Element are similar in this way, in that our key kind of motivation for making films and TV is always the people that we're working with and the talent and the sort of genius that they bring to all of these projects. So for us, it's about finding the people who understand us, who we understand, and who we feel that we can support in a very intuitive way, and making sure that we help them build their careers and make the best work that they can possibly make. And that can be anything across TV and film, because probably about 3 or 4 years ago we started to really heavily invest in our TV slate, and Normal People recently has been the kind of culmination of that work. But lots of things before that as well sort of showed our kind of enthusiasm for working in TV and trying to really make a mark in that area. But really, we have a slate of about 60 projects across film and television, all at different stages. And I think that one of the things about the way that the TV world has gone is that there's such a huge demand for all sorts, hundreds of stories that now actually kind of experience levels, and when you can get something off the ground, have changed quite a lot. So, historically, TV was a little bit of a closed book. You had to be at a certain level to be getting everything commissioned. But actually these days, we have been having more success with newer filmmakers or newer writers. And so that's opened the door a lot for the people that we can work with and successfully produce. So I think there's a lot of interrogation goes on within Element about, making sure we're doing the right thing. And as you were saying, Dionne, like currently we're in a very big discussion internally about diversity and inclusion and the representation of filmmakers and talent on our slate, and just also trying to really hold ourselves to account on that front as well.
An interesting question for you, Emma, as well. So when you're looking at a project, and it's something that I've talked to Emer at Screen Ireland, which is my name checking her, this idea of looking at projects, maybe they might be feature films, they may be TV, but this idea of returnable worlds, returnable characters, is that something that now plays into your mind when you're maybe assessing projects that maybe you want to add to the slate, or projects that you're developing that may pivot into becoming something else, particularly where you pick up say a book or a maybe something that exists already as an IP, and you're kind of trying to assess what this should be? Is that something that's now in your mind's eye a little bit?
I mean, it is a little bit. I would say it's not a priority. Like, we are very, like a lot of, obviously it'd be great to have returnable series and, find stories and characters that we can keep talking about. And, one of the funny things about Normal People has been the response of, the demands for the second series. But obviously it's a book. We finished the book. So, we do a lot of work through with our book scout. And so a lot of our material is literary material. And there are some books, I think everything on our site is a case-by-case basis, and we analyse it in order to kind of make the most of what it offers us. There's no one sort of particularly tasked with finding those returnable worlds, or, I suppose it would be lovely to find them, but a lot of our stuff is so authored that it almost kind of often lends itself more to a limited series or a one-off film. So it's not that we wouldn't like to find those things, but we're not prioritizing finding those things either.
Interesting. I think of things like The Young Offenders and how that created a spin-off series, or you could probably take any character in the Derry Girls and make a feature film about them at this stage. So I wonder if that was in your mind.
I think it's very clever, and a lot of people are doing it. And whenever anyone does it, I always thought the idea of the Brooklyn boarding house off the back of Brooklyn was a great idea, and I thought, that would have been. Wish I'd thought of that, but it's not the kind of priority. I think our thing is find good stories, find good characters, find the best way of telling that story, and then if you get the enthusiasm for a second go at it, then even better.
And maybe for Dionne and Ben here, I might bring you into this conversation as well, particularly when you're assessing maybe new applications or new projects that are coming to you. And you may have a company, I suppose, where the brand is well known, and maybe that creates a shorthand for you, and that you know what you're going to get sometimes. But what for you are the kind of maybe 2 or 3 key things that you look for when looking at a project to add it to and back it for funding within your company? So maybe Dionne, you might come in here first.
I think because talent is very much at the heart of a lot of our decision making, where it's not that everything that comes to us has to have all talent elements involved up front. So we're happy to look at things, if it's a producer bringing us a project with a writer attached but no director, or similarly a director coming with an idea who needs to find a writer. There's lots of ways in which we can assess things and build projects, but we I think when it is a director involved from the get-go, we want to know what they've done previously. It's quite useful to see if they've done shorts before, or if they're moving from a different medium possibly. It's really useful to just get a good sense of their voice and their vision and the kinds of stories they want to be telling in film and in feature films. I think we're looking at the ideas, and in terms of, for us, film has to have, or the ambition that it has some sort of longevity. So, we're living in a moment that I'm sure is inspiring lots of creativity, and people want to tell stories about what it's like to live through a pandemic. But whereas there are certain mediums that are slightly better suited at responding to that much more quickly, I think any stories that come out of this experience feel like they have to have some sort of universal, or speak to something that feels like we can all relate or find ourselves in it in some way, whether it's about loneliness or what it's like to try and find love or connection in this age. So we're looking at the what's the kind of, what relationship will the material or the project have to relate to an audience. And I feel like I've just started waffling actually, but I think it's it's about the talent, but it's also about the ideas and whether they feel fresh and new and exciting and speak to an audience.
And Ben, for you, maybe again, particularly editorially, are there key markers for you that you like to see maybe in a treatment or a script that comes to you? Is it the world, the visual writing, the characters? What is it that kind of appeals to you at Film 4 that you look for when you're kind of scanning through projects?
I mean, at the risk of sounding very similar to what other people are saying, yeah, it kind of is talent driven first. And I guess especially with the newer talent, they're kind of a bit like Tristan was saying, we hope to kind of build relationships with talent kind of over their careers. So sort of people who have an exciting range of shorts behind them, and we can kind of hopefully go on to make a debut and a number of feature films with. I mean, we are very material first, so it really is reading a script or a book or a treatment. We're not very prescriptive about what format things come in or what stage things come in. It's kind of whenever someone feels they've got something that excitingly represents what they're trying to do, we're happy to look at it. So it's kind of engagement with material first. I mean, worth saying, I guess, that there's some things we don't do very much of. We don't do very much like absolutely sort of straight down the line genre stuff. We hope that the phrase elevated genre is something we do talk about, and just making sure everything's kind of authored and interesting and has a very clear directorial stamp on it is important to us. So we don't do very many kind of completely straight genre movies. Historically, we haven't done that much period drama, but we have done quite a lot in the last few years, kind of following directors we find exciting into that space, as long as it's got a kind of clear contemporary message and something to say about the modern world and some sort of pure heritage cinema. But yeah, we get sent all sorts really, and it really is kind of just being excited by the material and the talent involved, and obviously sort of seeing where it sits in our slate as well. We do try and kind of make sure that we're commissioning in a sensible way that results in the slate being as varied as possible, and we're quite a big team and everyone's kind of working on different projects, so we do try to sort of make sure that we're not commissioning things that feel very similar to each other, to ensure we've got the range of filmmakers and projects. So that's, I guess, one thing that we do try and do, is make sure there's a kind of overall spread, and that where that's landing is kind of where we want it to be. We do keep a record of what we've commissioned over the last year, and then kind of look at it occasionally to kind of work out whether what we're actually commissioning is kind of in line with our company aims. So yeah, making sure that balance is quite an important factor, and we do say, we do pass on some quite interesting projects sometimes, saying, this is interesting, but we do have a few other things in a similar space, which kind of sounds, can sound like a brush off, but is actually true. We do kind of look at things in that way quite a lot.
And do you hunt to fill the gaps? If there's stuff that's missing from your slate, will you actively go out looking for it?
Yeah,
or will you wait for it to arrive?
No, well, that's always the sort of big discussion that we talk about and try and interrogate ourselves around, is making sure we're being as proactive as possible. Obviously we have a lot of projects and a lot that we're working on, but we try not to, I'm sure people say exactly the same, but try not to kind of just sit back and wait for producers to send us things. We try to be out there, making our own talent relationships with directors and writers and producers, and tracking shorts and festivals and TV and visual artists and so on, and kind of trying to make as much time as we possibly can to kind of form our own relationships in that space, and occasionally we do kind of match make talent with producers if it's someone we kind of really are excited about working with and they need a hand for introductions. So yeah, we sort of try and put ourselves out there and yeah, know what's going on out there in the industry rather than just waiting to be sent things.
And the $1,000,000 question, are there any gaps in your slate at the moment? Watch Emma and Tristan now quickly start to write down.
I think the broad stuff is always the, you know, more from female directors, more from the sort of inclusion, representation agenda are the things we talk about. We do talk about genre a bit as well, and making sure that, I mean, traditionally quite a lot of us slate as drama, so we do talk a bit about making sure that there's some, you know, exciting and authored thrillers and horrors, and you know, maybe more kind of audience-facing stuff alongside the more sort of auteur-y stuff as well. So we do have those conversations, but we tend not to kind of do big industry shout-outs about that, because, you know, we are partly here to support the kind of producing infrastructure, and I don't think we want to send people up the garden path by saying Film 4 wants comedy and, you know, then only commission a small number of that. So, but yeah, we want a genre balance.
Fair enough.
Make a balance.
And Tristan, I might jump onto you here, because you are a bit of a maybe the ultimate strategist when it comes to managing talent relationships. I mean, obviously your background, you worked with iFeatures, which was very much working with the emerging talent. And I said you've made your second feature with Peter Mackie-Burns, and, you know, you've got a very long and ongoing relationship with Andrew Haig. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that kind of, it can be, you know, it cannot always be an easy thing to, you know, manage those relationships and those expectations with your writers and your directors, because sometimes they're friendships, obviously, but they're also professional relationships. And maybe, you know, how you come at that, and maybe what you've learned over, you know, the last number of movies that you've done at the Bureau from that. And again, I know there's probably no one size fits all with these things, but again, I think you've probably got a good track record in figuring some of this stuff out.
Yeah, they're like complicated marriages. I think one of the really important things is, which we have always felt very strongly about, is don't start working with somebody unless you feel that you're simpatico to begin with, basically. Because if you know, and sometimes it's tempting, you know, ideas arrive and you're like, you know what, there's something really interesting in this, but then maybe something feels off. Maybe it's a personality thing. Maybe it's to do with maybe you both see the project going in different directions from that stage. And I think those are kind of risky relationships to embark on. I think our approach is always, if we love the first presentation of something, whatever that might be, a book or an idea or just a conversation about something, then the question is, how can we as the production company help make the best possible version of that? And so we don't approach things like us imposing what a project should become. It's more about agreeing upfront with the filmmaker, this is what we see as the best sort of direction this can head in, and then collaborating towards that. And I think if you don't agree at that initial stage, then we just don't embark on it in the first place. And I think that's one of the key things to making sure those relationships are mutual, you know, in your intentions. And I think another thing we've always tried to do is look at the sort of steps in a career and ask, for example, when I made Weekend with Andrew, immediately after that film, we optioned both 45 Years and Lean on Pete. But we knew that Lean on Pete was a much more expensive film and we wouldn't be able to make it next. So we made a very clear decision. We'll develop 45 Years with the intention of making that first. And that was with Film 4, who then backed that. And then it was off the back of the success of 45 Years that we were able to put Lean on Pete together. And we tried to take a similar approach, you know, with Harry Woodliff. Her first feature was, you know, very, very straight drama about a love story about a couple trying to conceive a child together. And her next film, which I was saying we're sort of in production on at the moment, is with Ruth Wilson and Tom Burke. And that is leaning into, I wouldn't say it's a genre film, but it's definitely leaning more into that space. And the hope is that that's kind of finding a way of making the material maybe a bit more urgent, you know, for as a theatrical film. And actually we have another project we're in development with Harry at the moment, and that is more in the kind of like, we need to talk about Kevin kind of territory. And so I see that as a sort of trajectory that, you know, her work is stepping in. And so we'll always try to sit down with the filmmakers and talk about what are those steps towards growing the films growing the audience for those films, which you have to do, and equally not taking missteps. I think a mistake often that gets made is people try to move up too quickly in a budget, and then suddenly things can get compromised, and maybe you stall, maybe you can't get that film away. So our approach has always been, let's take one sort of step at a time in the right direction. And I suppose, like, if you look at Yorgos's career, it's probably similar in a way. Like the Foreign Language, the Greek, the film he was making originally, and then doing a film like The Lobster helped pave the way for what would become The Favourite. It's a very clear. I don't know if it was a clear strategy at the time or approach, but it looks that way now. So it's.
It's actually, I don't know if it's worth jumping in on that, because it is quite an interesting one, because we attached Yorgos to The Favourite before The Lobster existed, but we couldn't have, it would have been very hard to make it in that order. And because we saw Dogtooth first, and then I think he went on to make Alps, but off Dogtooth he became attached to The Favourite, which was obviously a long time ago now. And that conversation with him about The Favourite led to him saying, well, I've got this idea called The Lobster, do you want to do it? And then quickly off the back of that came Killing of the Sacred Deer. So it was a real while The Favourite kind of rumbled along and like evolved and got over all of its issues, and found its, while we found the kind of Yorgos version of it, we managed to make 2 more films with him. And I think that it would have been really, really hard to make The Favourite without having made those films with him, just being able to have established the relationship and understand his methods, and, like also get to know his crew and the people that he likes to work with, so that by the time you get to this big film that you all know what you're going into. And I think that really sort of stands to what you're saying, Tristan, about like those relationships, because sometimes you can meet somebody in the first instance and get on really, really well, but you don't totally know how their mind works about certain things, like how they respond to criticism, or when you get to the point where the script isn't working, whether they're going to want to hear that, because when you're both sort of flirting with each other at the beginning, you're both being really nice to each other. And it's interesting, that like the longer that you spend with people, the more you work out about how the kind of back and forth in the creative relationship works, and how you have to obviously this is like the most obvious thing ever, but each filmmaker needs to be worked with in a different way.
Great. And actually on that, I mean, it's something we kind of discussed or was in our notes at the beginning, and maybe all 4 of you might have interesting examples here of projects that have been maybe going through the motions, you've gone through maybe a couple of phases of development and it's just not working. And maybe you tried something different, or maybe came up with a way to look at something that may have unlocked something. It may be that you brought in a different script editor, you did a table read. Do you have any examples of those types of scenarios where you tried something different, which then brought a project on or brought it forward?
Yeah. Will I go?
Yeah.
Well, there was 2 examples I thought of in relation to this. One was Rosie, a film we made a couple of years ago, because when that first came into us, it was a sort of 60 page script. This is an hour-long script, and so initially, because it was current affairs, we sort of thought, well, let's just make it as a TV piece and make it fast and do, use the TV model, because it's generally faster than film. And we didn't get the backing that we thought we would for the TV version. So we then looked at it, we were so determined that we would still make it, and we thought, well, we know that we will get the backing from the film board for a Roddy Doyle, Paddy Brannock piece. So then we basically talked to Roddy about how we could extend the runtime and expand the film in order to make it a feature, and apply the same kind of enthusiasm pace-wise to try and get it made. And that got us out of a hole. And I think it was because we were just so determined that it should live, that the idea that the first kind of approach of how we would do it, the fact that we ran into kind of a dead end there, we tried to get out of it. So that was one way.
And maybe Ben, do you have any examples of that from a funding perspective, where you may have a bird's eye view of where a company or talent tried something a little bit different to maybe before the development process that had a positive outcome?
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't going to give any sort of specific examples, but we have certainly done a range of things. So our traditional development model probably is the classic kind of send us some material, then we have a meeting and chat about it, then give notes and go off and do some work on it. And we have definitely in the past done things that kind of break up that model, usually, you know, led by the producer that we're working with and how they feel it would best be handled. But yeah, everything from bringing on, I mean, usually we don't have sort of extra third-party script editors kind of between the production company and Film 4. We kind of feel we can develop ourselves, but you know, occasionally bringing someone on to spend that really intensive time can help. We have done sort of workshopping sessions in the past to kind of put a writer or director in a room with actors and, you know, try and unlock something that way. On projects based on true love material, we have paid research for the trips or just a sort of dedicated researcher to come on and help with, you know, an element of the project. So yeah, definitely there's a range of things I think that we have done productively in the past when the kind of classic development model hasn't worked so well, including just having really intensive time with us. Actually, you know, normally it's sort of financier meeting on a draft, but you know, we have done that before, just, you know, getting people in for longer sort of page turn meetings with more people kind of in the mix, which I think has been quite helpful as well.
And you look at it can be difficult as well, because often, you know, huge amount of notes for a writer can drown them sometimes as well, and sometimes you need to kind of evaluate whether it's just 3 or 4 very concise direct notes are enough to kind of let them go off and fix 1 or 2 issues, and you'll attach the next issue. So that's why I think it's often important to have that strategy or some sense of a plan in place when you're developing a project, so that at least everybody is on the same page.
Yeah. I think that's very true, yeah, and that is sense internally of, you know, whether with one draft, you know, 1 or 2 big notes are going to kind of unlock more than reams and reams of page notes is quite important. And also we do co-develop occasionally as well, you know, with the BFI and other partners. So yeah, that's definitely something to keep in mind when there's more voices in the mix, how to keep things concise and manageable. The majority we do just ourselves, but yeah, certainly it's something we do think about, how not to intimidate people, and obviously different writers respond differently to notes, and some absolutely love them and some find them, you know, you can see why they might find them overwhelming. So yeah, you try and sort of tailor it to the people involved as much as you can, and you know, as Emma and Tristan were saying, it is about sort of forming strong trusting relationships, you know, first and foremost, really.
Great. And like we're kind of coming to the end of our kind of 40 minutes or so, but I might just throw it out to the future actually, to all of you to think, you know, I know diversity has come up a lot, gender has come up a lot, and you know, they're very pertinent issues within the industry right now. But I suppose looking towards the future, and particularly I suppose in light of the last 3 months and what we've gone through, what do you think are the types of stories that we're going to look towards maybe in the short and medium term for you guys? What do you think you'll be commissioning and producing? Do you think you'll be looking for maybe more light-hearted fare as a kind of a counter to this, or will you look at projects? I mean, Dionne, you talked about it a little bit before as well, you know, the reactions to this, going back to kind of our core values as a society. But what do you think? And again, there's other things coming into play. There's new technology, there's all of that coming into play as well, and elevated genre and how we tell stories differently. But do you have any ideas as to what you think the future holds for filmmakers and the types of stories that audiences are going to want and that we might tell? I'll throw it to you first, Tristan, to see.
Sorry, I was just thinking. I mean, I think one of the most important things, even aside from this moment in time, is, especially if we're talking about film, is to find projects that have real urgency to them. And urgency can be interpreted in many different ways, but you know, TV is so good now, and availability of films on streaming platforms is so strong now as well, that you are asked to people to go out of their home to a cinema, buy a ticket, to spend an evening doing that. It's a bigger ask today than it was 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so something about any film, if it's going to justify itself as a theatrical experience, has to have an urgency inside it that encourages people to go out and make that choice. So I think that's one sort of broad answer to that. Personally, I would love to find some stories, UK set stories, that really excavate our history here, you know, particularly in relation to diversity and You know, I've just finished reading The Anarchy, which is an extraordinary non-fiction book about the East India Company, and the absolute, you know, the oceans of wealth that a private company took out of India through the kind of 16th to the 18th centuries and led to the Raj, for example. That, you know, that's the thing that most people don't know anything about at all, and it is filled with stories. Now, somebody else has optioned that, and it's a huge endeavor. But I think those kinds of stories are incredibly, you know, pertinent and exciting to tell. I mean, why would we not want to explore that and explore our own history and where we come from? So, you know, we've tried to do that in the past, maybe not quite successfully enough. And I think it's something we'll probably, we'll definitely put more energy into trying to uncover those kinds of stories. And it's, yeah, I think that's definitely something we're going to pursue at the moment.
And for you, Dionne, do you think there's any maybe future trends or things that you think will bounce a little bit more?
I think yes and no. I think everyone kind of responds to the zeitgeist, don't they, in terms of how you arrive at your creativity. I just think ideas don't come out of a vacuum, so people are going to be influenced by what's happening in the world right now. And so I do think that will have an impact, but I also think, like, from our perspective, we still need to maintain the variety of our slate and continue to do lots of different things and support lots of different types of stories and filmmakers to get made. I think the question of cinema and the future of that is an interesting one to think about in terms of how our films find audiences. And again, just, you know, how we look at what success means for each of them, and whether it's about kind of more curated exhibition, you know, on a smaller scale than trying to go out to kind of wider audiences in that respect. But I think that what Tristan was saying about excavating our history and kind of more revisionist approaches to our past is really interesting. I think kind of lighter hearted stuff is also, just from a personal, you know, like my personal taste, I'd love to watch some comedies or just things that aren't, you know, about the pandemic or just people still being able to live their lives. And I feel quite optimistic about all of that. And I think it's, you know, lots of devastating things have happened recently, but I think in terms of storytelling, I feel like there'll be lots of really interesting stuff that comes out of this and ends up on our screens in a few years' time.
And for you, Emma, is there anything in, you know, that you're looking towards? Maybe I know you're obviously working on, you know, another Sally Rooney adaptation, and there's, you know, a huge pipeline of projects coming through, but maybe for new projects that you're looking to add to the slate, is there anything there that you're particularly excited about or looking for, or do you think audiences will maybe gravitate towards in the future?
I mean, I think, you know, every project we make, we kind of learn a huge amount from, and at the moment I'm sort of processing all the things we learned from normal people in order to apply them to the next thing, which will be different. You know, conversations with friends is very different, but I mean, the kind of the constant appeal of truthful human stories seems to be one of the only things that can ride the wave of a very, very chaotic world. And I think I think that creatively it is a really exciting time, but the world is moving so fast that, like, for any of us to kind of process it or respond to it before it's changed again is really, really difficult. And actually, you know, there's sort of been things on our slate in recent years that have been political and have felt really relevant, which, like, 2 days later are totally irrelevant. And so I think my focus is on just finding stories that can sort of withstand that in terms of just being classic human stories, you know, well told. And like Dionne, I'd really like to get some of our comedies off the ground, because like, certainly my family are just fed up at crying at all of the things we make. So there are some funny ones on the slate, I promise. But yes, so that would be some, you know, if there's one thing I'd like to just have some comedy, some more comedies coming through. But they are there, just, you know.
Ben, have you got any? Yeah. I mean, comedies sometimes are the hardest ones it's fine work on the page, you know, from a funder's perspective, the bigger risk, and be able to speak to that as well, you know. For you, are there comedies on your slate? Are there comedies coming at us, or what do you think will be some of the things that audiences aspire to look at in the future as well?
Yeah, absolutely. There are comedies on our slate, and we do have very similar conversations about, are we making quite a lot of quite downbeat films? But no, we've certainly done more, like we did Armando Iannucci's David Copperfield last year, which is quite a sort of upbeat and uplifting film. And I mean, kind of interesting in that, you know, it's colourblind casting, and, you know, hopefully that does something with a period drama that hasn't been seen before. We're also doing, everyone's talking about Jamie, the film version of the stage musical. So there's some sort of pretty more upbeat things in there, and that is something we talk about as well, having that mix. But like everyone was saying, I think it is, yeah, we're after stuff that feels urgent and contemporary, and that kind of really justifies itself as a film rather than a TV show. But absolutely agree that, yeah, we're absolutely not chasing sort of pandemic-y projects that are sort of very specifically grounded in the moment, because obviously, you know, the world will change, just as we weren't chasing sort of Brexit projects over the last few years. You know, it's or you maybe things that speak to those issues, but often, you know, in a way that will last, in a kind of way that's slightly sublimated, or coming at it from a sort of slightly angle that's not obvious. Is the kind of way we tend to think about things.
And certainly some of the, I mean, for me as well, just seeing some of the advances that are coming through technology wise. So even in terms of, you know, games technology now converging, you know, for that, and what that the possibility that opens up for films, that you don't have to have huge budgets to do some of these more CGI based films, and or you can do things in real time now with actors, which allows us to kind of broaden and be more elastic in what we do. I think there's some kind of really exciting opportunities there as well. So it's really interesting. I think a couple of things that have come across in our conversations, there's just three things strategically when you're looking at projects, be they on your slate or you're adding to your slate. You know, audience is very important, authorship is very important. And I think probably achievability is something that you need to talk about. So do you have projects at varying budget levels and varying scales? And as a producer, particularly, you're trying to figure out how you're going to finance these things ultimately. And I think looking at maybe your brand or your identity or what you stand for as a company, would be that as when you're approaching a financier, that they have that kind of shorthand, that they know who you are and what you stand for. And something that's come across very, very clearly is comedies maybe, but also, you know, that diversity thing and gender, it's going to be at the heart of what we do moving forward. And it's something that everybody should kind of think about when they're looking at individual projects and their slate and the talent that they want to work with, and by and large, and ask themselves that question if they're kind of hitting that bullseye. But we do have a couple of questions in, so I'm hoping if people do want to submit a couple of questions, we have a couple of minutes. So I'm going to bounce a couple of questions at you guys. I think Dionne and Ben, I think the first couple that came in were for you, and they're really practical questions. So Anura Kumar wants to know, Dionne and Ben, are you open to receiving pitches for funding from companies that haven't worked with you before? And if not, how does that affect the diversity of companies that you're funding?
Flag
great.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the submissions requirement is just by an agent or production company is how we ask for things to come in. Usually if it's a production company, if it's a company we've sort of never heard of before, we might just ask for a bit of information about sort of past work you've produced, if only shorts. But yeah, absolutely committed to working with new producers and bringing new producers through, along with new talent. And I think most of the debut features we've made in the last few years have been the producer's first feature as well. You know, sometimes with a more experienced producer sort of in an exec role, but yeah, that is part of what we're trying to do.
Yeah. And Dionne, for you, are you open to working with companies that you haven't worked with before?
Yeah, it's very much the same answer as Ben. Projects primarily come to us through agents or producers, and that's how we'll look. But as well as being proactive as a team about going out and finding talent and meeting with talent, you know, writers, directors, producers. So happy for things to be pitched to us in that way.
Yeah, and then a similar question, but slightly different, from Fiona Ash, both to Ben and Dionne again. Do you accept submissions from writers, directors who are not attached to a production company?
It depends how we come across them. I can definitely have conversations with writers or directors who don't have a producer. Usually, if it's not someone whose work I've seen, then it might come through an agent. And if it's something we're interested in, I think Ben mentioned before that we are able to be part of like matchmaking or making introductions to producers if that feels like a necessary part of the conversation to have.
And then another question that's come in, I might throw this to Tristan and Emma as well, particularly so from emerging talent, what is the best way for them to engage with you? You know, is it discussing maybe a one-pager? And will you kind of give them an initial steer as to something you might be interested in? Just some tips maybe for new and emerging talent as to how they might engage with you guys.
Shall I? Yep. I mean, again, from new in terms of new talent, you know, officially our policy is that things have to come through an agent if we don't know you. And I know in Ireland that is a little bit difficult because there's a lot of unrepresented writers and directors. You know, I think if we are going to consider something that doesn't come through an agent, it really does have to be pretty brief. And I think it's also really useful to be realistic about whether it seems like the sort of idea that we would make, you know, and I think that's a good place to start. Not to sound very harsh, but everyone is very, very busy. So just being kind of mindful of people's time and the sort of realistic outcome of what you're asking for.
And Tristan, for you, what's the best way for emerging talent to engage with you? Is it, you know, kind of an email with maybe a one-pager or maybe a couple of ideas?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the difficult thing is always that, kind of as other people have touched on, let's say we come across a short and then we reach out to a person, and there's a slightly different nature to the relationship. If we're receiving stuff cold, then it's very difficult for people to grab attention for within the space of an email to feel like, right, this is something we have to get on board. I think the way to do that is to keep it brief, to keep it concise. But I think also within that, you know, stories, the reason we all want to tell stories, watch films, read books, etc., is because they have meaning within them. And so you have to find a way quite concisely of getting across why your story, or not even just why, the fact that your story has meaning and power within it. So I think giving people some sense of the themes within it and an overview of the story in a very concise fashion, I think is really important. But actually, something else I was just thinking whilst Emma was talking is, you know, I think there's a good question, like, you know, like if we're talking about when you're starting out in your career, then often you're better off working with a producer who's starting out in their career as well.
Yeah.
Honest answer. If I think back to like when Andrew and I did Weekends, you know, that collaboration worked so well because we were in the same place, we were peers, and we needed that film in exactly the same way. It's very difficult for companies as they become more established and they grow to take on those kind of films. When we made Weekend, we made it for like £86,000 at the Bureau now. It's a big decision if I come in one day and announce that we're going to do that, because you know, it's a very difficult thing as a company with more overheads to take on board. And I also just think that relationships are often more fruitful if you're working together as peers. So
I do think that's a very pertinent point. Often the drive is to work with bigger companies, but I mean, sometimes people have to kind of figure as well that, you know, they have big overheads, they have staff, so they have to kind of very tactfully decide what projects that they can afford to kind of give that time and energy to as well. So, you know, it's sometimes that's often part of the decision as well, and it's often not personal with projects. You know, that's just business, you know, at the end of the day as well. Another question that's come in here, and it's kind of an open question, is do you feel the cinema experience is about to end as more and more people watch online and streaming and TV? Is this going to be a very negative thing, or do you think we can look at this positively? I mean, a very philosophical question there, so I'm not sure if anybody has the answer to that. If anyone wants to shout.
I mean, I'll say I hope not, because I love nothing more than going to the cinema and watching a film. Coronavirus will in some way or another pass at some point or another. So I think that let's set that aside. I think people will still want to continue to go to the cinemas. I think what is changing, and certainly what we're all facing as producers and filmmakers, is the sorts of stories the audience will respond to in that environment. And that's a very big part of our discussion every time we assess a project now.
Also, I think that platforms like Mubi and Volta and, you know, Netflix bringing on loads more movies as well, there's a sort of democratic thing whereby people can find films wherever they need to find them. You know, I think that's increased over the last while. And for some people, you know, getting out about mobility, all those things, it's not that easy to get to a cinema. You know, I've got parents, it's not that easy to get out all the time. So I hope, again, I think there's hundreds of people hopefully will rush back to the cinemas, but hopefully people will also know more now that they can find interesting films in lots of different places. So
yeah, great. There was a question, I don't think we're going to have time to answer, but Rachel, you had a good question, but if you want to contact me directly on that, she wanted some sort of advice about her, like a career in film development. Happy to come back to you on that, Rachel. Just, you'll find my email on the RAC Fund website and I'll follow up with you. But guys, we're kind of coming to the end. I did say I'd try to do something lighthearted, and maybe we've already covered this, but I mean, I suppose maybe what has been your biggest positive takeaway from the last kind of 4 months? And, you know, as I said, the world has been kind of shoved into a bit of turmoil, but, you know, what are the positives that you're taking away from it, maybe professionally or personally, if you want to share those as a kind of a nice way to sign off?
This is a bit of a joke, but basically I spent a load of my time flying around all over the place and feeling very bad about my carbon footprint. And I've realized now that I can actually do far more from my house than I realized. So, you know, talking to filmmakers in America, Sweden, the UK, Galway, like that sort of ability to reach a really wide talent pool and be able to connect with people is much changed for the better, I think. So
that's a great one. Ben, for you?
Yeah, I was going to kind of say the same, like professionally, just the fact that, you know, things still function really. Obviously, we're not making very much, but on the development side, it's been busy, and there's been something really nice about knowing that those kind of exciting and stimulating conversations have been able to carry on virtually. And I've got a 1-year-old as well, so it's been nice seeing her more on the personal side.
And for you, Dionne?
It would definitely echo with that, and also I think personally and professionally, it's just people's resilience, and that kind of filters into creativity as well. It's like the fact that people can still find the energy and have the capacity to whether it's, you know, film something or write something in this time is kind of extraordinary to me, but really great, and it gives me a lot of hope for how we'll emerge out of this.
And for you, Tristan, I know you've just had a new arrival in your household as well, so
yeah, I think the best thing around here is a 4-week-old baby. That's
congrats.
So, congratulations. So look, guys, I want to say a huge thank you to you all for taking an hour out of your day to share your thoughts with us. I hope the audience maybe has taken maybe something creative or practical when thinking about the development process and how they might actually plan that now, or if they have, how they might look at that again. Your insights have been really wonderful, and I say again, another positive takeaway that we could actually do this as a webinar series and allow the Galway Film Fleadh and the Film Fair and the Fleadh Forum to thrive in its 11th year. So thank you sincerely from me and from all our supporters, to you guys all for taking the time out, and thank you to all our audience for joining us in this conversation. This is the first of 3 webinars. We'll have 2 more again at 2 p.m. on Thursday and Friday. So if anybody else wants to join us again, tomorrow is about co-production and Friday is about the very pertinent issue of sales and distribution. So we look forward to seeing you all. But Dionne, Ben, Tristan and Emma, huge thank you for taking the time out to join us today and for the insights that you've shared. So sign off. Bye guys. Thank you very much. Bye to the audience.
Thank you. Cheers.
Bye.